Hey everybody, today I wanted to talk about expectations. And I know what you're really here for is this question. Can I learn to throw 500 feet? 600 feet? 700 feet? Whether you're starting out just trying to get to a 200 foot or a 300 foot milestone, we have questions like this. Many of us want more distance. That's what we're trying to achieve in the swing. And so I recently got to a point in my form development where I found some limits. And what I meant in this case is physical limits. I had gotten to a point where I could generate a lot more power in my swing. And of course, I'm excited. I'm throwing a lot. I'm trying to push the limits. And I had a day when I was out on the course and just playing with some friends. I wasn't feeling great, especially that morning, so I got there a bit early and make sure I limbered up and stretched more than I usually did. And of course, on a couple of the open bomber holes, I wanted to push it even though I was trying to rein it in. And I just couldn't find my form. No matter what I did, I couldn't find my distance. I just felt awful. My body felt kind of cranky. I got through the round, and the next day, inflammation everywhere. My knees, my shoulder, my elbow, awful. And so I shut down for a couple of weeks. I got off the field. I didn't throw at all. And I did some learning about expectations and what can I do for my body to make sure that I'm approaching this in a more deliberate, safer way that helps me to progress and not go on shutdown, enjoy the hobby as much as I can. And so questions like this are interesting to me because it's been made an analogy on the forums. You can see in the link below. Maybe a 500-foot backhand, which is around 70 miles per hour of ejection speed, give or take, is like a 90-mile-per-hour fastball in baseball pitching. And that's a sort of elite level where at the top level you're going to see people have it. Not even everybody has that kind of distance on the pro scene at this moment. And it's not a guarantee that everybody might reach that. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about those expectations and how then you can understand the things that go into athletic training, which a distance backhand certainly is, and how to plan smart around that. So somebody like Drew Gibson is a fast, explosive guy, and he can crush out there with the best of them. And so when we look at somebody like Gibson, there are a few variables we need to consider. The guy's been doing it for a while. He's been pushing his distance and learning the sport for years. And many of us first learning just haven't had that experience. We might have started later and so on. And so the length of your playing history is going to matter, certainly. And those of us that picked it up later in the life, specifically after childhood, are going to have a couple of real disadvantages. You're going to have a motor learning disadvantage. When kids are younger, this whole idea of like they learn like a sponge or through osmosis isn't too far off from the truth. We know from the psychological science. They're much better at modeling after visual representations, and literally their brains aren't getting in the way. And what I mean by that is that adults tend to be much more analytic. They already have sets for how they think about the world. Their bodies already have programs of movement, and they tend to be basically too cerebral about it, right? Guilty as charged, right? I really like the analytic part of knowing how form works in the disc golf backhand. Part of that's because my body's so dumb and it doesn't have carryover from other moves, right? So when I'm learning these new moves, I don't have things from baseball or hockey or other sports with similar mechanics in different ways to work from. It's going to be a disadvantage when learning form, something to keep in mind. If you're taller and you have longer levers, you're probably going to have a bigger distance potential. And so throwing a disc from higher on the ground and being able to whip it with longer levers has some very distinct, well-modeled advantages in other contexts in biomechanics, and it's going to apply in disc golf. If you have a longer wingspan than your height, what's sometimes called ape index in rock climbing, going to be good for you. Drew Gibson, scuttlebutt is he's around 5'9", 5'10", but he has something like a 6'3" wingspan, right? So he's not only got very compact, explosive form, but he's whipping longer levers to achieve the distance that it gets. And so when you think about leverage on the disc, if you have shorter levers whipping longer levers, you're going to get a better mechanical advantage. And so if you have long hands and fingers and long forearms and relatively long upper arms compared to narrow shoulders, you're going to get more leverage on that disc, right? And in that order, right? If you have relatively really long hands and relatively short upper arms, right, up to some limits, that's going to be an advantage for you. Now, there's some speculation out there that if you have a shorter, more compact body, maybe you can integrate motions a little better, but you're going to need more optimal mechanics to find your distance potential. And so I think anecdotally, you'll see this. Players that just have longer levers starting out might be throwing farther than their friends, even if their form isn't especially good. And then later on, maybe the compact guy really puts in the time on his form and he can play some catch up and can do that consistently. So I say fear not, right? So you got the body you got and you work with it to maximize it. And part of that is your myotype, the composition of your fast and slow twitch muscle fibers. And so we're going to see in a second that some people have more of those than others, and that's going to have implications for their training and potential. Last but certainly not least is whatever advantages you got, your training really, really, really matters. And so keep in mind people like Gibson, people like your Paul McBeths, were growing up in environments and had resources going in where maybe the YouTube era for certain people wasn't there, but if you're growing up around the pro scene, you have models to look after and learn from more quickly than people out there on the amateur scene that have less time and access to those resources. Okay, so there's two main paths to improvement in pushing limits, I think, at the extremes. One is sometimes people point out the McBeth path. Paul McBeth learns to throw far and reins it in by his own admission. He'll say that in interviews. And so when he was going through his development, that's how he approached it. It's worth pointing out, however, that Paul had a couple of things going on for him before he even went into disc golf. So he was a pretty athletic, active guy in his youth, and he had a pretty well-developed baseball background where there are serious mechanical transfer advantages in baseball. So the forehand has a lot of similarities to a sidearm pitch in baseball, and the backhand, as Paul himself pointed out, is, in his words, essentially a baseball swing. And so he was able to figure out how to get the leg mechanics and the posture and all these other things to transfer maybe more quickly. His body was probably better attuned to the forces and moving that way. So that's going to just help you get off the ground. Paul also has very long levers in the right places. So look at this guy. He's got very long arms. He has relatively narrow shoulders compared to that wingspan. And even though he's only somewhere around 5'7" or 5'8", depending on the report, he's really working with a positive ape index. He's going to be able to whip those levers more quickly than somebody of the same height with shorter arms. And something that I just love sharing is that Paul McBeth's hands are so large that he can palm the span of a disc. So somebody like me, I'm sitting here 6'1". I got these little stubby fingers and these big palms. I can barely get my fingertips to the edge of most discs. This guy can wrap those fingers all the way around. And you can go on Twitter and he points out, he says in response to this image, he can easily do that, right? So best levers in the right places, big advantage when you put that in his mechanics and athleticism. The guy is gritty. He puts in the time and dedication. He has access to these experiences, right? Don't take away from people the effort they put in to get to the top levels. This guy went from baseball to disc golf, and he will tell you in interviews, I thought I could make a bigger impact in that sport compared to my impact in baseball. He was determined from the outset to get to the top and to make a difference. And the guy has been actualizing that goal. It's just a great story. I recommend you go check out Brian Earhart's The Flight Diary for the 2-part interview of Paul McBeth. It's just a great story to hear in Paul's own words. So on the contrast, you've got the slow and steady path. And so this is just work on it a bit at a time and chip away. Advantages here are that it's going to help mitigate your risk of injury, certainly. It's going to make more time maybe to onboard good mechanics, but it can protract your development if you don't push limits, right? So if you're not finding what the limit is and trying to push past, odds are you're not going to get past that. And so who is this for? Well, if you've got a lot of restrictions, if you're coming into it older, if you're recovering from injury or you have some mobility limitations, especially those cases, you might be more on this end of the spectrum, right? Maybe it doesn't matter to you to throw much farther. You just want to throw a little bit safer. People can have pretty mechanically sound swings, and for one reason or another, the distance doesn't matter to them, and that's great. Chip away at the goals and work on it a bit at a time. In my own case, I picked a sort of compromise strategy. I always knew I wanted to push the limits. My body is telling me, hey, you got to have some reasonable expectations. You got to learn about rest and recovery be kind to yourself. It's going to take some time, right, on top of the form work. And so, in my opinion, got to get the form mechanics in a safe place. If you're coming in like a McBeth and other people, you're starting younger, your body's moving well and powerfully and has some resilience. You might get to blasting faster. People like me, we're going to need a little bit of time to both get the mechanics and build up the resilience. And everybody's mileage is going to vary there. So we love this game. How far will I be able to throw? Lots of people speculate. I think it's hard to get an exact number. I would love to have an actual biomechanical model that really well predicts distance potential. It's going to have a lot to do, of course, just with the leverage and the length of things, but other stuff's going to matter too. So let's just take a case example. There's a guy here that I happen to know well on the left. We're going to pick on him and compare him to this guy by the name of Calvin Heimberg, who I hear is pretty good at disc golf, so he's probably a good example. Guy on the left's pretty tall. He's above average. He's about 6'1". Depending on your source, Heimberg is somewhere between the 6'3", 6'5" range, so advantage Heimberg in that case, but above average both here, so maybe there's some potential for both of these people. However, next item down, we get to wingspan. The guy on the left actually has a slightly negative ape index. His wingspan's a little bit shorter than his height. Not great. Hard to find a real source on this for Calvin. Let's put it somewhere around his height. Maybe it's a little longer. Not sure. We could get a measurement. Now let's talk about the weight. The guy on the left is coming in at a substantial 230 or so pounds. Calvin's probably less than that guy. Just eyeing him up. I don't have his weight, but I would just estimate that. So weight isn't necessarily a disadvantage. So you've got stockier guys, Garrett Gurthie, for instance, absolutely bombing, obviously. The way he gets his power is different than somebody like Heimberg. Gurthie is going to use a lot more up-down. He's going to have a vertical force coming into his plant. He's got a bigger hop. Calvin Heimberg has actually a lateral hop if you watch his drives, but he's very horizontal along the ground. People like Simon Lizotte, Eagle McMahon as well. Look at the legs. Calvin is going to be able to leverage that body down into that weight into the plant, whereas the guy on the left is probably going to benefit from more gravity going into that, right? So if you can get just enough hop up to help accelerate more easily down, natural advantage, using the weight to the advantage. The problem is that pushing around more weight will always take effort, right? And so working a little bit against the guy on the left, he's going to need pretty clean mechanics to maximize that weight. Bad news for the levers. So even if the wingspans are, let's call them equal-ish, let's say Calvin's is just a little bit higher in ape index. Look, this guy has shortish fingers, big square palms, doesn't really have long forearms. He's got stumpy upper arms. Measured it out because I have that obsessive tendency. This guy's shoulders are a couple inches wider than expected for his height. So you could basically not engineer a worse upper body in terms of the wingspan for a disc golf throw, right? You'd much rather be a Heimberg on the right. So again, mechanical advantage is going to be important to the player on the left. Youth athletic advantage, guy on the left is staring down the barrel of middle age. Guy on the right is young. He's been at this a while. Clear advantage to Calvin Heimberg. Myotypes, know the guy on the left pretty well. Can tell you he's a slow, twitchy kind of guy. He's not going to get in there and be your most explosive guy. Watching him play basketball is like watching time stand still. It is not going to go well, right? Guy on the right, probably pretty quick. At least he certainly moves quick than the guy on the left can overall, okay? So let's talk a little bit about this last idea, which I found interesting to learn about. It's, you're going to come in, maybe you're moving slower, maybe you're moving faster. What's the variability? Can we train it, right? If you're a rat, you're going to be mostly fast twitchy. And so here at the top, you can see the percentage of slow twitch fibers in each of these species. Rats are among the fast twitchiest as they get. And fast twitchy looks like what you expect it to be. It's like really quick movements, no matter how big the movements are. Sloths being on the way other end. And what I found interesting is that humans and nearby neighbors like chimps are among the most variable species, right? We're all different from one another in a lot of ways, and one of them is this composition. And so some of us have got slow twitchy fibers almost approaching that of a sloth. We're not quite getting to the twitchiness of rats, but certainly some of us are faster and more explosive than others. So it's interesting to think about what that implies for your training, right? Whether it's disc golf or otherwise. So Identical twin studies are often used to try to parse out genetic and environmental factors. And a brief summary of that, you'll often look at identical twins and non-identical twins. And the idea is that if they're non-identical, it's kind of separating out the genetic influences and some of the environmental influences, and then you can kind of get an estimate of what's really attributable to the genetics. And so in some of these studies dating back a while, you'll see that identical twins will share a similar myotype concentration, and the fact that that's more shared in identical than non-identical is cited to suggest that that's really genetically endowed and maybe immutable. However, we've learned a lot about gene by environment studies in academic contexts, and one of the problems with identical twins is that they still share a lot of identical environmental features. These feed back on one another. People that are genetically like seek similar environments. Those feed back on another. So lots of other studies in lots of contexts, not just myotypes, suggest that things are actually often a little bit more environmentally mediated and changeable than we think. And so it turns out that myotypes are trainable, a lot of lines of research suggest. And so even if you're starting out on the more slow twitchy end and you need to learn a more explosive movement, doing training in explosive movements has benefits. And so anybody that's spent time in a plyometric training program will often attest whatever fast twitchy muscle fibers you have, you can still get them a little bit more engaged. So I take this on myself. Part of that's just resilience training, right? So I know that my body needs to be better conditioned for the impact of a distance backhand. So I work on some of those more explosive movements. I work on moving quicker. I work on being able to handle forces moving those directions. Over time, it makes it easier and easier for my body to manage the forces of the backhand. Not as clear where the distance potential comes in, but if it's like a explosive move in any other sport, of course, putting some training to the body is going to give you advantages. You need to have the form to throw correctly. Athleticism is never a bad thing to have. Now, when you're doing your training program, keep in mind that you're going to have cycles of learning and forgetting, and how you practice has a lot to do with how well you do in the long run. And I am obsessive about this, and that's part of what got me into trouble, right? I was aiming to make a lot of progress quickly. I respond quickly to feedback from more expert eyes. Shout out to Seabass22 again. And I want to fix it, want to fix it, want to fix it, want to reinforce it. Too much for the body. So the good news is that you don't have to do it that quickly, and as long as you're staying healthy, you should do it at the fastest pace you can, but no more. And the idea here from Ebbinghaus, a very influential psychologist of learning, there are a lot of things that psychology gets a bad rap for. This is one of those things you can take to the bank. Across basically any learning profile, whether it's cognitive or motor or whatever, you're going to learn a lot quickly. Most people attest to this, and then you're going to start to plateau at some point, and then gains get harder and harder over time. But wherever you get to, how well you remember that depends on how well you reinforce it. This seems like a no-duh, but think to what you do in class, and you cram for a test the night before, and you regurgitate it for that exam, and then you never remember a freaking thing again, right? That's because you didn't reinforce it, and you came way back down this learning curve way quickly, and almost all that information decayed, right? Never to be found again. However, if you space that out with quizzing yourself, right, being quizzed by the instructor, you're going to keep resetting that forgetting curve. It's going to get up closer to where you were before you left off. And then every time you do that, you're going to forget less and less. So this is why the riding the bike analogy works, right? You've done it many times if you've learned it. And even if you haven't done it in a while, very quickly your body will reactivate that program because it's been so well reinforced. So in the disc golf backhand and other movements, you want to have those reinforcement moments. And the good news is that you can space them out over longer and longer periods of time with less and less forgetting. And so what this suggests is that you want to be aggressive about your learning and reinforcement early on, but it's easy to get back on that horse or back on that bicycle later on, okay? And so spacing things out a few days at a time is totally appropriate. And then if you're only doing a little bit of form work here and there after that, odds are it's going to integrate better and it's going to have a more permanent change in the context of the form. And so anecdotally, I can attest to this. There was a big change after a lot of very intensive form work. Shutting down probably helped because sometimes break help consolidate learning in different ways. Once I came back, that form's right back. It's even a little bit more fluid. If I need to make a change, it's very easy to make an adjustment or two before the next time, right? And so, just try not to be too panicked about it like I was, right? Get out there, slow and steady, keep reinforcing. Okay. So the biggest lesson I learned through my recent experience was about tissue adaptation. This was the thing that just surprised the heck out of me, not having ever had to do explosive athletic training. Okay. My body was just like in every possible way not ready for it. Okay. Your nerves and your motor learning will always precede, and this makes sense, the things that follow. First, you're going to figure out how to move, and then things like muscles and bones and fascia, the little connective tissues and those soft tissues, are going to start to adapt. But they still take weeks to adapt, right? It's part of why when you go to the gym and you start lifting, these things keep developing over time, little cycles of tearing down and building up. And those softer tissues, ideally, you're taking more of the brunt of the force. This is why, when you're training pishers, part of the idea of strength training is resilience training. And so I'm thinking, great, like I'm pretty active in the gym, I'm doing those sorts of things. But what I didn't account for was this other effect, this lagged effect on the ligaments and the tendons and the cartilage, right? Putting more jerk stress through inconsistent form or just more overuse through more consistent reps is not great to ligaments and tendons and cartilage that aren't ready for it. And so what happened to me basically was, as I was starting to get kind of spikes, and I could even feel it in my body, of like this fluid, powerful, easy feeling movement, and those discs are speeding up, what I didn't account for is something's got to give in terms of the adaptation of these really vulnerable tissues. And so when I woke up that morning with that really just profound inflammation across my body, I had reached some critical threshold where my body was saying, no mas, right? I can't do this anymore, at least not at this pace. And so I now know that I'm expecting this to be at least a 2-year process. And at my age, I'm expecting maybe even a little bit more than that. So you can kind of take this thought experiment of, if I gave you excellent form today, right, what could you expect? Well, you can expect some isolated burden on like your right hand, backhand, pec deceleration. People will tend to feel sore there after a lot of distance work, even if they've been throwing a while. I would also suspect, if you don't have a lot of built up resilience in these other tissues, that you've got some risk of joint overuse. Don't care how good your form is, right? This is adaptation over time. So think of this journey, especially if you're new, especially if you've been throwing, as a long run journey, right? You can learn a lot of things very quickly. You got to be careful with the load. You got to give your body some TLC and let it develop along and grow as part of the ride. So thinking about it, you can think of charting yourself on a couple of dimensions here about how you want to organize your training. If you're a novice developing your form, and let's say you've been throwing a little bit, and you might be at a stage where throwing 250-foot shots, maybe 30 of them every few days, is something manageable. You'll wake up, you won't be particularly sore the next day. This is something that you can do without challenge, okay? Well, there's going to be some range of stuff that's excessive for you. Even if there are fewer shots, maybe, the farthest discs you're throwing are 300 feet. So trying to throw 20 of those out of the gate the next session every couple days is probably going to have some effects on your body. If you don't hurt yourself right away, you're going to start to get some of those micro strains. Scar tissue is going to build up slowly over time. You're going to just start feeling pretty cruddy, right? And of course, for all of us, there is an impossible range, right? Maybe you have no chance starting out of even a single time reaching 400 feet. So the idea of trying to get out and every day blasting even 5 of those shots is just out of reach for you right now. So that's okay. How would you manage this in any other context? Well, if I'm having you learn to do the bench press, first I want you to move safely, right? And that's part of the hard part in disc golf. It's a complicated move. And then if you're moving reasonably safely, I'm not going to put 500 pounds of plates on it the first time I do it, okay? This should be a no-duh, but I think that it just sometimes doesn't quite get across to some of us, myself included, is, you got to find a limit. You got to march that manageable out over time. And the disc golf backhand, again, explosive, fast demands on the body ultimately. there's adaptation over many weeks and months. And so just keep pushing that manageable margin out a little bit over time. And eventually, if you're an advanced player, your form's in a decent spot and distance continues to be your goal, you might be able to get out there every 3 days and throw 60, 425-foot shots, and that's sort of in a routine range for you. You'd still have some range where, your resilience is higher, so you could keep pushing more longer, but maybe 475 is usually your reasonable max. You're probably not going to get much better by throwing 50 shots all of a sudden, trying to get to 425. Somewhere between the two is what you want to be pushing. And so just march that out in terms of load. And again, these are big explosive moves, so you probably don't want to do it every other day or so. Give yourself a little bit of time in between for that recovery cycle if you're really pushing distance in a fieldwork session. And even the players that are very well developed, at some point there's something their body and their form currently can't do. So let's not do that, right? So let's work on something that's replicable. Let's work on something that challenges the body. And again, here I think the spacing is important between days. So I care a lot about this because I've had a couple of walks near the red line, things that if I had kept going, I might not be playing disc golf right now, and that scares me because I love the sport so much. And so 80% of disc golfers report injuries in one form in this peer-reviewed study. We don't have a ton of good data on this. I'll be interested what happens at the pro scene as the demands keep getting higher and higher and higher. We're hearing more about injuries, but just among people going out, including rec players, look, elbows and shoulders taking the brunt, backs, knees, and ankles. None of this seems surprising to me. Keep in mind that elbows and shoulders are often referred injuries, meaning that somewhere upstream in your throw, something is not working well, and your elbows and your shoulders, the late part of the throw, are taking the brunt of it. That's either coming from strong arming, putting way too much muscle into it and trying to throw with your arm, or even if you figured out how to have a relatively loose, whippy arm, people have all kinds of postural problems and upstream problems that will put jerk stress on that joint, right? So if you're getting off that back foot wrong, in the drive step, there are relationships with the amount of stress it puts in the shoulder. So often the things that are causing you pain aren't right where the pain is. And I think that's the importance of good form review and working on your mechanics. And so, keep in mind that if you unfortunately do have an injury, the more severe it is, the more that manageable margin is going to decrease. This is kind of obvious, right? So post-injury, come back slowly, talk to your doctors, don't go on Reddit, don't go on DG Course Review for your medical advice. And then when you're ready, and if you're working with a therapist or otherwise, find those reasonable ranges to march back out, right? So as I've come back, even as the form is coming there and in some ways better than ever, still making some adjustments, I am not trying to crush the farthest possible distance every time. I'm approaching it as a soft sort of rehab mode, right? Where I'm saying, okay, like let's go maybe to 80% today, see how it's feeling good, space out the sessions a little bit more slow and steady, and you'll do better. And keep in mind that the physiological reason that this really matters is you've got stages to recovery. And early on, you'll bleed. Internally, that might happen too. Even if you're not having intense microbleeds, you might have inflammation, right, in the muscles and the joints. And it takes time, days, weeks, months, for that proliferation of new tissues and remodeling into the shapes that can handle the burden really resolve. And so if you keep re-injuring that tissue while trying to recover, you build up scar tissue, long-term outcomes are worse. And so just not worth it, right? Take the time to recover when you're getting back into it, consult with experts, slowly but surely. So in my case, I'm fortunate to have stopped before the point where it got really that bad, but I still approach it with some expert input about what's reasonable. How would I do this as an athlete is the question I'm trying to answer, right? It's an athletic move at this point. How do I do that safely? How do I play smart? So your practical takeaways here to wrap up. Look, improving your mechanics is always a good thing, even in very well-developed form. And from watching how people with a more expert eye than myself critique people at a high level and help them improve, everybody has something to work on, right? It could be really tiny, it could be a couple degrees here and there, but there's something that you can tweak, right? And things are going to drift over time, right? Paul McBeth still talks about making little adjustments. One thing gets out of whack. My weight gets too far forward. He'll talk about this in interviews. So there could always be something to work on. And so the idea is that, just getting them clean, getting them smooth, it's always worth the effort. It really is. And I think when you're thinking about intensity and pushing limits, especially distance form work, I now think of this as a dedicated activity, right? I have days that I'm going to work on my distance. And my distance form is the same mechanics as my upshot form. But the problems are more obvious anytime you try to throw farther, right? And so as the forces increase and the problems maybe get a little bit smaller, you got to have some patience for that, right? You're going to make an adjustment or two at a time maybe. And as you're throwing shots with more force and more frequency in that session, give it at least a couple days in between, especially at first. So this was my lesson, was like my body is not used to throwing with this kind of force. It's going to take weeks and months for tissue to start building resilience. So in the meantime, I'm trying out this 3 days between any significant distance session, right? For now, any significant throwing session as I'm kind of ramping back in. So a couple days for muscle recovery, some sources cite you might need another day for tendon depending on the load of those tendons. Given that I had some aggravation, I'm playing it more conservatively. But I can already tell you my practice is far better, right? The session back was the best I've had in the sense where I was like, wow, my body feels really fluid. I feel more in touch with my body in the ground. Getting a little bit of the rust kicked off after a couple weeks does have a difference. But, making tweaks here on out will be more effective and reinforcing what I already do every few days, right? And makes the changes easier. And as the body recovers, I will expect that I will be throwing farther over time with that strategy than, burning the candle at both ends. So, again, weeks and months. If you've been doing this for years, even if your form is in a full rebuild, you probably have more resilience. But again, as the motion changes, you're going to tax different tissues. So just be mindful. If you're older, adaptation is slower, especially among those ligaments, tendons, and cartilage, right? So unfortunately for me, I'm still not very old. I'm thinking about entering middle age. That's when a lot of these plasticities start to decrease more quickly. And so, the good news is that the adaptation still happens. It's just at a slower rate. And so push limits make them reasonable, of course. So start where you are, right? If you're McBeth and you're coming in and you're young and you're athletic and you have powerful lower body mechanics from other contexts, you're probably going to be able to push limits faster in certain ways. Set goals with respect to where you are, right? If you're coming in here later and you don't have similar activities, the bar might start a little lower, and that's totally okay. Be responsive to that feedback from your body, especially. For me, one of the great joys of disc golf has been I've learned more about the human body and how to use mine and be in touch with it, which helps me care for it better at this point, right? And then I can watch my performance and make smarter adjustments at this point, right? I know what to ask a little bit better when I'm getting some input from somebody else. I know when to call it quits, right? If a session's not going well, stop, right? Get out of there, right? And always, if you can, get a trained eye. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. In this case, good form work, good mechanics are going to save you problems down the line. So with that, really appreciate your attention. I hope that this more sort of academic style of talking about it and reflection was interesting for you. I'm really looking forward to getting back out for the next module. I'm going to do a little bit more field work, and I really want to help you guys think about how to pull it all together, right? So I've learned a lot too about how to make that form more integrated and approach it as a more athletic skill, especially in the last few weeks. And so hopefully I'll be helping you do that. So with that, hope to see you soon and have a great day.